For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. When people talk about the greatest defenses in the history of the NFL, the defense that's always brought up and is always in the discussion is this defense right here. Of course, I'm talking about the 1985 Chicago Bears, as in, the only team in NFL history to win a Super Bowl and be nominated for a Grammy. In 1985, the Bears won their first and only Super Bowl in franchise history as of this video getting released. And while there were many factors in their team's success, including a very good offense that ranked number 2 in football and another incredible season by the incomparable Walter Payton, who had over 2,000 yards from scrimmage, the main reason that the Bears were so successful was because of their vaunted defense. The Bears finished the 1985 season allowing just 198 points, or 12.4 points per game, and that number is made even more impressive when you realize that in their final 10 games, including the playoffs, the Bears allowed 84 points, or 8.4 points per game, shutting out 4 opponents in that stretch. More than half of the starters on the defense were named either an AP First Team All-Pro or a Pro Bowler, and 4 players on that defense would eventually find themselves inducted in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. When you allow just 10 points across the entire playoffs, when you have 64 sacks in 16 games, or 1 per quarter on average, and when you finish number 1 in the league in points allowed, yards allowed, first downs allowed, turnovers allowed, interceptions, rushing yards allowed, and rushing touchdowns allowed, yeah, you're gonna win a lot of games and be remembered as one of the greatest teams of all time. And if you want an example of just how good and just how talented that 1985 Bears team was that you might not know about, you're gonna get one right here. Because we need to talk about not the game they had on Monday Night Football against the Miami Dolphins, as in their lone loss of the season, and the one game where the 4-6 defense was completely exposed by Dan Marino and company, but rather, we need to talk about the game they had after that, as in the game against the lowly Indianapolis Colts. Because in 1985, the Bears were so good and were so talented that they were able to beat the Colts without having any idea who the Colts were. Seriously. The Bears might not have known who the Colts were, but now that you know who I am, be sure to hit that like button, that subscribe button, and that notification bell so you don't miss a moment of the action when I do post a video. We're trying to reach 60,000 subscribers and build the best football community on YouTube and the best place for football history anywhere, so your support would be greatly appreciated, and thanks in advance. They knew, quite literally, absolutely nothing about their opponent, and they still beat them, and once again, from a defensive standpoint, dominated. Basically, this was like if an NFL team was playing against another NFL team with the knowledge of said team being that of the people the Tennessee Titans find on Broadway for their schedule release video. Because this is the story behind the 1985 Chicago Bears, and their, shall we say, bizarre game in preparation against the Indianapolis Colts. Before I talk about the bizarre incident that took place during the game, we need some context to understand the importance of the game, as well as the opponent that the Bears were taking on during this week. It's December 8th, 1985. It's week 14 of the NFL season, and as we're heading down the home stretch, we've got an inter-conference matchup on our hands between 2 teams in the Midwest, with the Chicago Bears out of the NFC taking on the Indianapolis Colts out of the AFC. For the Bears, in terms of the standings, this is not a big game for them in the slightest bit, and I mean that in the best way, because they've been so dominant that with 3 weeks to go, they have absolutely nothing to play for, having clinched the number 1 seed and home field advantage throughout the postseason, ensuring that the NFC side of the bracket will run through Soldier Field. They are the best team in football, and it's actually comical by how much they're dominating, with the number 1 offense and the number 1 defense in the league, and a point differential of plus 218, or 90 points better than second place, and a whopping 123 points better than third place. They're that good. However, this game does mean a bit for the Bears from the standpoint of not just wanting to finish the season undefeated at home, but from the standpoint of not wanting to lose 2 straight after they lost last week on Monday Night Football to the Miami Dolphins. Plus, if the Bears win this game, they tie the 1934 Bears for the most wins in a season in franchise history. So there's some history to play for here on this cold, chilly day in the Windy City. And the good news for the Bears was that, on paper, they were absolutely expected to bounce back from that drubbing at the hands of the Dolphins on Monday Night Football. Because their opponent for this Week 14 matchup? Well, it was the Indianapolis Colts, as in this team right here. The Colts were everyone's get-right team in 1985. If you were struggling and couldn't get anything going, or didn't have momentum on your side, just play the Colts. There's a reason that the Bears were a 19.5-point favorite entering this one, and that's because this team, the Indianapolis Colts, was absolutely terrible. Through their first 13 games, the Colts were 3-10, boasting the second worst record in the AFC and being one of just 4 teams in the league with 10 or more losses through the first 13 games. The Colts had no defense to speak of, allowing the 5th most points in football through the first 13 games, and their point differential of -85 was not just a bottom 5 point differential in the league, but was the second worst in the AFC, only ahead of their divisional rival, the anemic Buffalo Bills. Indianapolis was entering this game against Chicago on a 5-game losing streak, where in those 5 games, they allowed 34 or more points in 4 of them, lost by multiple possessions in 4 of them, and got outscored on the whole 161-90, or an average of 14.2 points per game, or 3 possessions per game, since the 2-point conversion did not exist back in 1985. Basically, if there was any team in the NFL that you really wanted to play, it was this team right here. It was Rod Dowhower's Indianapolis Colts, who had nothing to play for, who were abysmal in every facet of the game, and who were going to finish the season with a losing record for the 8th straight year. Legitimately, the Colts might have been the most irrelevant franchise in the NFL in 1985. They didn't play a single game in prime time. They started 3 different quarterbacks. There was not one moment during the season where they were at or above 500. Outside of left tackle Chris Hinnon, not a single player on the Colts made it to the Pro Bowl. The team had 0 AP First Team All-Pros. They didn't have a huge fan base, as it was pretty localized to Indianapolis since they were brand new there and weren't very good. And not only did they have the worst preseason odds of any team to win the Super Bowl at plus 10,000, but they never made it seem for 1 second like they had a chance at competing for a playoff spot. The Colts were just kind of there. They existed, and that was about it. No one, let me repeat, no one liked watching this team play in 1985 unless you happened to be playing against them. The San Francisco 49ers had Joe Montana, the Miami Dolphins had Dan Marino, and the Chicago Bears had Walter Payton. But I'm going to take a guess and say that not many people in the country, and not many casual football fans for that matter, could name a single player on the Colts. And I bring that up because, amazingly enough, neither could the Bears. Because prior to Week 14, and prior to this game right here, where the Chicago Bears were trying to avoid losing 2 in a row and getting upset at home, a reporter came up to a ton of Bears players before the game and asked the players about the Colts. Now keep in mind that even though the Colts were not a good team by any means, the Bears had, presumably, been watching film on the Colts for the entire week. Presumably, they were watching the tape and figuring out the tendencies of certain players and how to exploit them. You see players in the press conference before a game talk about the great players that the other team has. The defenders will talk about what they have to do to stop a specific quarterback or a running back, and the offensive players will talk about how to get past specific players on the defense. Basically, when the 49ers play the Chiefs this season, players on the 49ers know who Patrick Mahomes is, and players on the Chiefs know who Christian McCaffrey is. So this reporter asked players on the Bears to name a player on the Colts. Seriously, name one player, literally any player currently on the Colts. Name one of the guys that you're going up against in a day or two. It's almost like the Celebrity Jeopardy sketch on SNL when they go to Final Jeopardy and Will Ferrell just asked the contestants to write down any number. This wasn't a history question or a gotcha question, or name a player on the Colts when they won Super Bowl V, or some weird obscure question. This was asking players on the Bears to name one singular player on the Colts, the team that they were presumably watching film of and studying for all week. And no one could do it. Seriously, not a single player that was asked about the Colts could name a single player on the team. Wide receiver Dennis McKinnon could not name a single player on the Colts, and said that he was completely and utterly stumped. Offensive tackle and future Hall of Fame player Jimbo Covert named someone on the Colts. The only problem? He wasn't a player. He named Robert Irsay, as in the owner of the team. Yes, because when Covert is blocking against the Colts defensive line, he's going to be blocking none other than Robert Irsay, a 62-year-old who has never played a single down in the NFL. Again, this is not a tough question. Just name one player on the team you're playing. And linebacker Otis Wilson, whose job it was to stop the ground game and stop the running back, said that one of the players on the Colts was that running back guy, referring to Randy McMillan, the former first-round pick in 1981. That running back guy. That's like me saying that for the Jaguars in Week 1 to stop the Miami Dolphins, they have to pressure the quarterback guy. And they have to make sure that that receiver guy doesn't get the ball in his hands too often. So far, we've got a player who was stumped, a player who just said a random position, and a player who thinks that a player on the team is 62 years old. But the craziest answer, by far, when it came to this game right here, came from cornerback Leslie Frazier. As a cornerback, you would think, more than any other position, you would know players on the opposing team. You would know the receiver that you're going up against so you can study their tendencies and their route tree. You would know the quarterback that you're going up against. You know at least someone on the team. But nope. Because when Frazier was asked to name a player on the current Colts, and was asked to name a player on the 1985 Colts, he said, completely seriously, Johnny Unitas. That's right. Leslie Frazier legitimately thought that the quarterback he was going to be facing on this day was Johnny Unitas. Now, to be fair, Unitas did play for the Colts. However, he last played for the Colts in 1972, when Frazier was a teenager. He last played in the NFL in 1973. Unitas was in the Hall of Fame by this point and was 52 years old. Frazier legitimately thought that the Colts quarterback and the man he'd be trying to prevent from throwing the ball his way was a 52-year-old. That is like me thinking that when the Jaguars play the Dolphins in Week 1, they're going to have to go up against Dan Marino. Genuinely, did the Bears watch any film on the Colts at all? How could no one on the team name a single player? It's not like a reporter asked them about a certain player on the Colts who was the third-string offensive tackle and just signed 2 days ago, and they had no idea who they were talking about. This was literally one player, and no one could do it. And yet, despite that, and despite clearly knowing nothing about their opponent, probably spending a fair amount of time during the game reading the nameplates on the back of the jersey just because that was their first exposure to them, the Bears won the game and absolutely dominated, even if the final score of 17-10 might not show it. The Colts had one fluke play, a 61-yard touchdown pass late in the fourth quarter, and that was it. The Bears never trailed at any point during the contest, had double the first downs that the Colts had, winning that battle 22-10, had more than double the rushing yards that the Colts had, winning that battle 191-99, didn't turn the ball over once, and held onto the ball for nearly 2/3 of the contest, with the Bears having 39 minutes of possession when all was said and done. It definitely wasn't the prettiest game, but it didn't have to be. The Bears won, they got their 13th win, and they got back on track. All without knowing a single player on the team that they just played. When I think about what happened in the game between these teams behind me right here, I think about what former New England Patriots head coach Bill Belichick did with his team. because he made sure that every single player on his team knew everything there was to know about the opponent. I'm not just talking about players on the team, I'm talking about weird historical facts that will never come in handy during the game. It's not like they do a trivia contest in the second quarter and the winner gets 10 points added to their final score. He made sure that his players knew everything there was to know, and he was so detail-oriented. And then on the flip side, you have the 1985 Chicago Bears, who were so good that they didn't even need to know one iota about their opponent before playing them. Not a single player, not a single name, they knew nothing. Maybe the Colts were just that bad, but regardless, it's a crazy thing to think about 40 years later. Even though the 1985 Bears are not forgotten at all, and are remembered as one of the greatest teams in NFL history, and maybe the most referenced team in NFL history, this game against the Colts seems to be pretty forgotten, because it wasn't a dominant performance with the scoreline, it was a good team beating up against a bad team, it was a good team beating up against a forgotten team, and obviously, the Bears had much better games on the defensive front that year. But of all the games, this might be the one that deserves a second look, just for how absurd it was that the Bears were able to beat a team not knowing a single one of the players on the team. Because when it came to trying to name a player on the Colts right before actually playing the Colts, the Bears were doing the Super Bowl stumble. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.